Senator Cardozo.
Madam Speaker, it is indeed a great pleasure to speak here on Bill C-11, the Online Streaming Act, which updates the Broadcasting Act of 1991. While this is my first speech in the Senate, I hope I will have the opportunity to provide something more like a maiden speech in the near future when we're not as pressed for time. Indeed, I think we are all agreed here that it is time to be updating the Broadcasting Act when the technology it regulates has advanced so far in the last 32 years. I should start by telling you that I had the good fortune to spend 6 years as a commissioner at the CRTC around the turn of the century. That is the turn of the recent century, not the other one. During this period, my job was to be working under this act day in and day out, and I have to say that even then it was beginning to be out of date as the internet was just taking hold. Yet it was a very comprehensive law with flexibility that allowed us to regulate the changing scene. Now, here's the thing I've always found to be so special about the Broadcasting Act. It is uniquely Canadian. La loi régit une société.
And it regulates a unique society, the Canadian society. There's virtually no other country that has all of our unique qualities. Other countries may have some of our key characteristics, but only we have them all. I would suggest that, by and large, the Broadcasting Act has done pretty well through all these years.
Now, just to age myself, I will note that, in fact, I did appear before the House of Commons committee that was working on the Broadcasting Act during the Mulroney government back in 1991, when I was a very young man. And I'm happy to say that some of the changes we advocated back then around the definition of the Canadian people were indeed added to the bill at that time. Little did I know that 6 years later, I would be at the CRTC implementing the Act, not to mention speaking on the review of that Act in the Senate 32 years later. I would like to focus my comments on Section 3 of the Act, the unique aspects of the Canadian people that the Broadcasting Act works to enhance. Here are some of the main characteristics that are key to our society. We have 2 official languages, and the Commission constantly works to ensure that we have a robust broadcasting scene in both languages. While at the CRTC, I was pleased to be part of the decisions to ensure TVA became available across Canada, to ensure that La Société Radio-Canada TV and radio was made available in all provincial capitals, and to significantly increase the number of specialty channels in French. Indeed, with the advancement of digital technology, the Commission has been able to ensure more fulsome broadcasting in both languages, with a large number of French channels from coast to coast to coast. Canada also has a well-developed multilingual broadcasting scene, which rivals any other in the world, broadcast for the benefit of and produced by a variety of Canadian ethnocultural communities. The first multilingual broadcasting was begun by the legendary Johnny Lombardi in Toronto in the 1960s, and gradually programming in radio and television expanded across Canada, with the CRTC licensing more multilingual services. And the most recent addition to the television scene was the Aboriginal Peoples Television Network, APTN. Certainly, the licensing in 1999 was one of the most significant hearings during my 6 years at the CRTC. The hearing was memorable. We heard from some of the great Indigenous leaders in the field. Abraham Tachalik of Nunavut chaired the board of what was then Television Northern Canada. The accomplished Grande Dame of Indigenous film, Madame Alanis Abonsawin, reminded us of our obligations, and the award-winning actor Adam Beach highlighted the significant talent that existed in Aboriginal culture. But I remember thinking of the irony at the time that it was the First Peoples who were really the last people to get a television network. But today, 23 years later, APTN continues to grow and expand its services across the country, surpassing all expectations, while there are many other Indigenous radio and television services. Since around 2000, the CRTC has also focused on ensuring diversity in programming by English and French broadcasters so that what all of us see and hear on mainstream radio and television reflects the Indigenous cultural and racial diversity that makes up our country. Now, layer on top of all this about our uniqueness the following. Unlike any other country, we are located beside the most dominant cultural machine in the world, the American cultural juggernaut. And unlike any other country, even those who consume a lot of Hollywood product, we share not only a language, but we share a culture, an accent, we share sports like football and hockey, and we share expressions. And so distinguishing Canadian music and programming from American content is harder, and Canadian viewers have less reason to be loyal to the Canadian product. And on the French side, the French language broadcasting has unique challenges. While our Francophone nation lives in a sea of English-speaking North America, the silver lining is that Francophone consumers are uniquely loyal to the French language programming produced in Quebec and the rest of Canada. The Quebec star system is vibrant and entrenched and followed widely by fans and viewers. The English-Canadian industry can only wish it had the same following in Canada. But still, with the enormous popularity of American music and programs, there is a critical need for the state to help French language programming, whether it be the federal government, the Quebec government, or any other provincial government. This is why C-11 is so popular in Quebec. It brings more revenue for Canadian-made content on our traditional and online broadcasting. Now, Section 3, especially Section 3.1(d)(3), directs the CRTC to regulate and to accommodate this diversity in clear, contemporary ways. On another matter, various comments have been made recently about the way CRTC operates, and some of these comments I would consider a bit gratuitous. I can tell you from my experience, I found it to be one of the most open and transparent agencies in the federal government. Yes, they are not perfect, and occasionally they are bound by some of the confidentialities they have to keep when there are commercial competitive issues at stake. But I would say to you that it's one of the agencies that works hard to hear a wide variety of voices, and will work to balance out always the powerful corporations from ordinary Canadians. They are also certainly open to be challenged on how they do hearings and consultations, and I would suggest that they do public hearings as good or better than any other federal agency or commission. There were some comments yesterday about what was termed as identity politics, that it entered into the affairs of culture. I am a permanent student and teacher of Canadian history and politics, and my reading of Canadian history is that it has always been about identity. Some may call that identity politics. Much of it is positive, some negative. From the beginning of our history, the First Peoples, the Indigenous peoples, have always been diverse, and they were proud of their diverse identities. Indeed, they have taught us to engage in land recognition, where we recognize the history and the territory of the particular peoples whose traditional lands we find ourselves on anywhere across Turtle Island, and we pay respect to them. But with the arrival of the settlers, we should be reminded that they came from England and France, and based on their identities, English versus French, they had a battle back in 1759 on the Plains of Abraham, and as they say, the rest is history. Over many years, the colonizers imposed their identities, their languages, and their religions on this land, and spent centuries trying to submerge the identity of Indigenous peoples, sometimes, as we know, using rather unfortunate means. In a related historical matter, let me talk about the Fathers of Confederation. Yes, just the fathers, no mothers. Just men of British and French origin, quite pointedly no Indigenous people. even though there had been the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which recognized them and their land rights. Their Indigenous identity was not included in Confederation, certainly not as founders of the Canadian state. There were also many black people, loyalists who moved here from the United States, indeed the ancestors of Senator Don Oliver and Senator Wanda Thomas Bernard, who had been in Canada for well over a century by then, but again were not among the Fathers of Confederation. Let me touch on the British North America Act. Remember that name. What kind of North America? A British one. A foundational document is all about identity. The English and the French had guarantees of Protestant and Catholic schools that were absolutely conditional to the signing of the document. Had those identities not been carved in stone in our Constitution, there would have been no Canada. And here's another thing. In the 1800s and early 1900s, when land was being given to settlers from English and French and from Eastern Europe, the government was specifically taking land away from Indigenous people. The children from one group were being taken by the state and the church and subjugated to horrendous conditions. So here we are now, and we wonder why some people are rich and some people are poor, some people have power and some people don't. And outside this chamber, there are people who ask certain groups to just stop going on about their identities and get over it and be just like the rest of us. So I come to Section 3.1(d)(3 and want to say that is why it is needed. This is how we are building the great Canadian nation, where we respect Canadians of all identities and origins. I just want to touch briefly on the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Section 15.1 says that we are all equal. Section 15.2 says that government programs that aim to ameliorate inequality are permitted, to create equality. Indeed, the adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People also falls directly under the powers of Section 15.2 of the Charter of Rights, and now we see that Bill C-11 also will respect under it. As I close, I want to say to you that ameliorating inequality and advancing equality of all Canadians is one of the fundamental reasons for governments, whether it be in matters of culture, social or economic policy. And Bill C-11 aims to do this. It takes us further on the path to advance this great country. For the future, it enhances the ability for more Canadian-made content in the online media world. The world needs more Canada, and the increased revenue will allow for increased Canadian-made content in the world.
For this reason, and many others, explained by my colleagues, I will be truly honored to vote in favor of Bill C-11. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Madam Speaker, rather.
Senator Usakos, you have a question?
Cardozo would be kind enough to take one.
Senator Cardozo, we have just over 1 minute left. You want to take a question? Senator Usakos.
Senator Cardozo, congratulations. I think it is your maiden speech in the Senate. There's a lot in your speech that we can dissect, but I'd like to just look at one aspect where you talked about how popular C-11 is in Quebec. And I think C-11 is popular in Quebec amongst those that are fans of cable, that are fans of the traditional broadcasting model of doing business. It's very unpopular among streamers, bloggers, tweeters, all those young Quebecers that are living on these new platforms. So my question to you is, the reason why it's so popular amongst Francophones as in those new platforms is because they don't get narrowed into just a few million Francophones that listen to their capacity to develop their art and culture. They get to broadcast around the world to millions and millions, hundreds of millions of Francophones. So my question is, why do you want to narrowcast Francophone culture and have them only provide their services to a few million Francophones when they have hundreds of millions around the world?
Senator Cardozo.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for a question. I would have felt ignored had you not asked a question of me, so I thank you very much. Indeed, the question you raised is important. I am not using the word narrowcasting. I'm using the word broadcasting. And I think what this bill does is to provide more revenue for the creation of Quebec content, of Canadian content, to go across the world. So I think this bill is doing exactly what you'd like to see it doing. Certainly, it will provide more revenue that comes from all Canadians for Canadian content, for Quebec content, as we want more Canada to go across the world.